Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington, where there's so much talk about the Doge. Kailey, we all remember when Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy came to town. This has been a massive conversation, and there are a lot of questions about, well, how could this become policy? We've asked a lot of those questions, connecting the dots. Is it possible to cut $2 trillion in government spending, as Elon Musk had said at one point? The governor of New Hampshire has the answer. He says the mission of the Doge is achievable.
Yeah, writing a new opinion piece in The Hill today. For models of efficiency, Musk and Doge should ignore D.C. and look to the states. And I'm pleased to say joining us live here in our Washington, D.C. studio is the New Hampshire Governor. Republican Chris Sununu is here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Governor, nice to see you again.
Nothing
Thanks
like
for
a governor
us.
coming to Washington.
Yeah,
Usually
exactly.
I bring
Your
trouble.
favorite town.
Well, and you don't
By rocks and
necessarily
pillars.
speak kindly of Washington in this piece in
Nor
terms
should
of
anybody.
its fiscal functioning. My question, I guess, is if we're looking to the states, we're dealing with smaller numbers, right? State budgets are measured in billions, whereas the U.S. federal budget is measured in trillions, and they want to cut $2 trillion of that. Is that really realistic?
It's realistic. Probably not tomorrow. And you know, structurally, they're going to have to get into the big things that nobody wants to talk about, Social Security and Medicare. Again, that is not likely going to happen tomorrow, unfortunately, but it has to be dealt with. Kind of the crux of this piece is, as a lot of folks and you guys have discussed, in about 8 years, $1 trillion in interest payments goes to $1.8 trillion, right? Just in interest payments. Social Security and Medicare go insolvent all at about the same time. So you're going to have kind of this perfect storm of financial crises. If Washington does what they typically do and wait to the last minute, that's not a solution. That's just reacting to the crisis. Doge is very interesting, and this election is very interesting in that it has created a very unique situation where you have an outsider in Elon, an engineer. I'm obviously very partial to engineers, as I am one myself. So he's not beholden to the establishment. He's all about fixing big challenges and fixing and finding efficiencies in big systems. So he's ideal to do it. The key is, like anything, as an engineer, you have to know how the system works before you can really figure out how to tinker with it. Well, there's going to be some low-hanging fruit with potential executive orders, but you're going to have to use political capital. And he actually does. He's an outsider of Washington that brings political capital with him. When Elon Musk walks in your office and you're a congressman, believe me, you're going to listen. Not just do whatever he says, but you've got their attention. So if he uses that capital in the right way, and the best part about what they've done, which gives me a lot of optimism, is they've put a time window on it, right? They got 2 years till July of 26 to get this stuff done, get it all moving in the right direction. So, and because it won't be some long-lasting additional piece of government. But as I warned in the piece, a lot of presidents have failed at this attempt. This is a highlight, pivotal moment for Trump, for his administration. They can't blow it. And the last big piece here is Washington has to look to the states, because states, especially Republican states, but really all states, they make tough decisions. They've found efficiencies. One example I give is in Iowa, they went from 37 agencies to 16. Did Kim Reynolds get penalized for that? No, she got championed. The voters thanked her for doing it. So what was traditionally seen as making tough decisions and getting politically penalized in the past, if you don't make those tough decisions now to Congress, you're going to get penalized. And that's what the Speaker has to understand. It's in his political interest to do the hard work that no one's been able to do before.
We can nibble around the edges here for a while, but to your point, long term, a balanced budget amendment should be reconsidered. There are a couple of them that have been proposed. They tend to not get as far as you want them to here. But the question is, can you do that and make it work without getting to, you just talked about it, Social Security and Medicare. That's why this never goes any further.
So again, those things are going to become insolvent in very, very short term. So at some point, they're going to need to address
this administration to deal with it?
I trust this administration more than the next one, and I don't even know who the next one is. And that, look, Trump was elected not just on policy; he was elected to be a disruptor, to break that establishment mold as an outsider, and he's brought outsiders with him to do it. And he's got a lot of a very significant political mandate and more experience than he did even in the first term. So the wins are in the sails to get it done. My argument on a balanced budget amendment, it's so critical. By the way, 49 states have balanced budget amendments. We all live in those means. I could tell you, There's no state that's a bigger financial mess than California, right? But even they have a balanced budget amendment. I mean, they end up taxing their citizens and not handling it very well, but they are managed better on a fiscal basis than the federal government. And that should be a warning shot across the Republicans' bow.
I want to return to something you were saying about Elon Musk specifically, that he might be uniquely suited to this role because of his nature of being a political outsider, but still having political capital. He also has just normal capital. His net worth went to $400 billion yesterday. Yeah. Is there not some conflict of interest here you are worried about in him specifically, who has companies that contract with the U.S. government having a say in this?
So surprisingly, no, and I'll tell you why. Because he's so rich. I mean, $400 billion, a couple billion more here or there. This isn't a guy that lives extravagantly.
But he still cares about the fate of, say, SpaceX.
Of course he does. But that's not Doge, right? So you can talk about grant programs and all of this sort of thing, but this place needs a complete structural overhaul. And that's what he's actually really, really good at, taking on giant challenges. People didn't think there was going to be a privatization of going to space. He said, no, we can do it. And he figured it out. So it's not all on him, but he provides the political capital in a way because he's so wealthy. It's not, he doesn't have a direct financial interest in this per se that is appreciable to him at all. Everybody in D.C. does. Everybody in D.C. wants to keep their job. They're all elected officials. They all have a bigger conflict of interest to do nothing than to actually listen to someone like Elon and the recommendations that come out of this group. You got to find efficiencies everywhere. I think what they're doing with defense is going to be great. Having an audit, I think that's very important. You don't have to lose a single gun, bullet, or soldier just by becoming more efficient, creating more competition within what is kind of a cabal right now of contractors and contracts within the Department of Defense. I mean, you can save $100 billion there. I didn't do the details, but there's about 16 executive orders alone that I counted. Over 10 years, $1.5 trillion, just on Biden's executive orders, by the way. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, but structurally they're going to have to take up something more substantive at some point. Doesn't mean it all happens tomorrow. And getting to a balanced budget amendment agreement basically says this. We're going to go forward in such a way that we eventually get to a balanced budget. We bring things back into the fold the right way. We make that compact with America that says your family has to live by a balanced budget and so don't we. That in itself will reinstore so much trust that Washington doesn't have. They have it with governors and state legislators and mayors, but they don't have it with Washington. So it's in their political interest to do the hard work. Now, I think it's going to take time, of course, but when I get a little concerned. I hear Republicans say, well, we're going to cut that program and that program. Well, that sounds fine. You want to cut them? Cut them. I don't care. But that's nipping on the edges. That's political speak. Yeah. You need real structural, financial structural reform here. And now's the time to do it.
Well, in the meantime, this administration wants to advance the Trump tax cuts, make them permanent, likely add to the deficit in the process. Where do you draw the line? How much is palatable until the cuts start to kick in?
So I think the cuts they have now and continuing them is very, very important because you need a growth model here too. And what, as you guys I think have talked about, there's so much cash being held by so many of these large corporations, right? What is $450 billion just being held by Berkshire Hathaway or whatever it is, right? And then you multiply that with all these other large, because these companies were holding on to it because all the inflationary risk that comes with regulation of the change or not change if Kamala were to win of administrations, right? There was so much regulatory inflation there. They were holding their cash because they didn't know where things were going to go. Hopefully with the tax cuts in this administration, private equity starts moving a little more, deal flow starts moving a little more, cash starts being released, and really promotes that growth. So while we're making some tough cuts, while we're making the tough decisions, block granting things back to the states. I mean, think about it. Department of Education is the one they talk about all the time. You can get rid of 90% of that bureaucracy, save tons of money, and still block grant the same money back to states and allow states have the efficiency of reinvesting those funds how they see fit. What's good for Massachusetts is different than Minnesota or Nebraska or New Hampshire. So let them decide. I can tell you as a governor, when we look at all these programs and all this money that comes from D.C., there are so many strings attached. We have to say no to some of this money sometimes because it's so not in New Hampshire's interest to take the money because of all the additional attachments to it. You block grant things back, believe in the states. As you've probably heard me say before, them founding fathers, they were wicked smart, as we say in New Hampshire. They really were. Federalism works. States have already done a lot of what Doge is looking to achieve on a smaller level, to be sure. but a lot of it is just copy and paste. We've done the hard work. It's not some newfound crazy idea. It's actually Washington is the last one at the table to try to figure this out.
Well, you obviously are still speaking with us as an incumbent governor, but your term is almost up.
Tick-tock, 29 days is
the clock.
the
clock is ticking. So, of course, we're wondering what the future holds for you. And I do wonder, given that it does seem the American people delivered this mandate of more efficiency in government, more disruptions, not just with the election of Donald Trump, but with a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. With that kind of Republican leadership mandate, does that make you rethink how much you want to be involved in politics in the next 4 years or
no, not in the next 4 years.
2028?
No, look, maybe long term, I would come back into things.
How long is long term?
I'm nothing I'm thinking about, I can tell you. I do want to stay involved, and that's why I'm going to keep writing op-eds and maybe do some media and all that sort of thing. I left a resume at the front desk for y'all, but you know, I'm economically driven. I'm a business guy. I'm an engineer. That's why I'm so passionate on the Doge thing. And again, I go back to governors, not just myself, but governors all across the spectrum have really done a lot of this hard work. I think that needs to be championed. We talk too much on the national level of just what happens in this bubble in D.C., but frankly, the bubble of D.C., both media and otherwise, never talks to the real people out in the rest of the country. That's why when around mid-September, it was clear to a lot of us that Trump was going to win handily. And it was like, well, how can you say that? How can you say that? The people that were questioning that were in New York and Washington. The rest of America was going, you just talk to your neighbors. You could see it coming. You could see where this was all going. So, again, I like to keep that political itch scratch. I'm more of an economics guy and a private equity guy and a markets guy. So I'll stay involved somehow. And I'm obviously, I think the first of the nation primary in New Hampshire is going to be really big with an open race in just 4 years.
And maybe both parties. How about that?
Yeah, right. Undoubtedly both parties.
I think you have a new cause, though. If you read to the bottom of this op-ed about the Doge, you write, by the way, eliminating daylight savings time, big win.
Well, let's not forget that.
I could see you and Ed Markey joining together on this issue. You're going to be kidding me, though. It's dark till noon in New Hampshire. I know it. I'm from New England. You're ready to do that on the regular?
Does anybody want to keep daylight savings time? Have we found that guy yet? Well, I don't know.
I think so.
Yeah.
Don't you want to see on the kids see so they can get on the school bus in the morning?
We can handle all that. We can handle all that. The going back and forth is it's antiquated. It was created for farmers. It's just completely antiquated. So the
farmers of New Hampshire are talking,
and I'm listening.
Yeah.
I'm for one. I'm listening. As is my successor, Kelly Ayotte. She's listening too.
What's your advice for Kelly Ayotte? The first challenge she's going to face when she comes in. We've only got about a minute left.
The advice is do right by New Hampshire first and foremost. Call the balls and strikes like you see them. If it's a Trump thing and he does right, give him credit. If Trump and the administration, Republicans don't do right, call him out on it. Right? She has a platform as a governor, as someone who understands how these things work, and is going to undoubtedly be working hard to keep that live free or die spirit strong. To just call the balls and strikes. Don't overthink. Say this to everyone. Don't overthink the politics. Just do right by your state, right by your constituents, and it'll all work out in the end. The politics takes care of itself when you get stuff done.
29 days. You're going to be on an island? What's the first
no, I'm
thing
getting
you
a
do?
job. I'm not a wealthy man.
Fair enough.
I, as a civil engineer and a guy who ran a ski resort, neither of those actually paid very well. So we're looking for a real job.
Stay in touch with us. We'd like to keep this conversation going.
Absolutely.
In the new year.
Thank you guys so
much.
much.
It's great to have
Thanks
you, of
for coming
course.
in.
Governor, for now, of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, the Republican from the Granite State. Great conversation you'll only hear right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
New York is a popular place to be if you are an incoming member of the second Trump administration, or at least a secretary designate. As we saw this morning, ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange was President-elect Donald Trump, and he brought along with him some of those who will comprise the most senior levels of his cabinet, assuming, of course, they get confirmed, including the likes of Treasury Secretary-designate Scott Bessent, RFK Jr., was there others as well that we could talk about. But he, of course, was there because he was selected as Time's Person of the Year this year, the second time that he has been awarded that. But he used it as an opportunity to make his case once again about what he intends to deliver for Wall Street.
The economy, I believe, is going to be very strong. We do have to solve some problems. We have wars going on that we didn't have. We have a lot of things happening that we didn't have that would have never happened. They would have never happened, but now they have happened. And I want to get them solved.
Interesting, if you're with us on Bloomberg Radio, to look at the cadre of officials behind Donald Trump. To your point, Kailey, it's interesting who was invited. RFK Jr. standing behind him, Scott Bessent. We saw Kelly Loeffler, interestingly. Howard Lutnick was just off to the side. He was cropped out of that image. And Brooke Rollins, I thought was interesting, the pick for agriculture, reminding us of how close they are and the roles that they're all potentially going to play here when it comes to setting policy in the new White House. Gregory Korte is with us now, Bloomberg politics reporter at the table here in Washington. It's good to see you, sir, with the New York Stock Exchange display this morning. Speak to the optics here of this incoming president being there for the markets.
Yeah, I think we hadn't seen Trump in public for quite a while. Perhaps this is the most we've seen of him since the election, unless I'm forgetting something. But it was a moment for him because, on the one hand, he could go to the stock exchange and tout this remarkable year that we've had in the stock market, which he takes credit for not even being in office. He has made the case, this is something he attributes to Scott Bessent, his incoming Secretary of the Treasury, this idea that this stock market exuberance we've seen this year is entirely due to the fact that people predicted that Trump would win the election. We've crunched the numbers on that, and there's not a whole lot of statistical evidence that that's the case if you look at the poll numbers and how they're correlated to what the market's done. But it has been an extraordinary year, and he wants to sort of tout that. But also he was in New York because he's the Time Man of the Year, and that's something, that cover is something that he's always coveted. He's gotten it twice now, when he was elected the first time and now the second time. So it was a good moment for him to come out and bask a little bit in the transition. Sure.
Well, and talk more about things that we imagine a Wall Street audience is pretty receptive to, like, say, lower corporate taxes. He talked about that 15% rate once again, but we're reporting now here at Bloomberg that his team is considering a lift to the SALT cap, which many gathered there at the NYSE also care about, but only to $20,000. And I wonder how that's going to go over.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are people in the higher tax jurisdictions in this country, and the New York metropolitan area is one of them, which should say that the Washington, D.C. area is also one of them, where people pay a higher proportion of their incomes in property and state income taxes. They had been able to write off on their federal taxes. Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 took away that deduction, or at least capped it at $10,000, made it really unfeasible for most people to claim it. Most people then took the standard deduction. This was a thorn in Democrats' side because who lives in New York and Washington? Mostly Democrats. But when Trump was campaigning, he went to Long Island, where there's maybe a little bit more of a reddish tint than the city, and this is an issue there as well. He promised to do something on it. We'll see how this all comes into the mix, because he also promised no tax on tips, no taxes on Social Security benefits, no taxes on overtime. There's a lot that he wants to do in addition to extending the tax cuts of 2017.
That's for sure. Stephen Moore, talking to Bloomberg about this idea, by the way, said they're opposed to an unlimited deduction, which, as Kailey mentions, is kind of the news here, because that would amount to, quote, the biggest tax cut for millionaires and billionaires ever, unquote. So did they just find the number that they think could pass?
There is one sort of policy disagreement with this from the beginning, is that unlike other deductions, it's not doubled when you are married filing jointly. There is a marriage penalty to this SALT tax cap that's stuck in a lot of people's craws. So effectively doubling it to $20,000 kind of lets you, perhaps that's the mechanism to do it, or maybe they just double it. But that was one, I think, legitimate policy question around the whole SALT tax cap.
But unlimited wouldn't have been palatable to a lot of states.
I mean, look, when you talk to people at the higher end, now, you know, the fact is that a lot of people on the higher end structure their income in such a way they don't pay a whole lot of taxes anyway. And one thing that did benefit them was the SALT tax cap, but they had other ways of reducing their income as well. We do get some data on how it's structured. Yeah, absolutely. People at the top of the top decile of incomes, not surprisingly, got the biggest benefit from it.
All right, Gregory Korte, Bloomberg White House and politics reporter. Thank you, as always, for joining us as we consider something so important to our audience here on Bloomberg TV
Most
and radio.
read story on the terminal.
That SALT cap. Pretty much everything related to salt, I feel like.
Always.
Rockets to the top of most read on the terminal.
Gregory Korte, SALT correspondent.
Yep.
It's the best job in the room.
Yeah. Function of the day. Read Go on the terminal. You see what people are reading. And we certainly know our political panel is paying attention to these stories, too. Joining us today, Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Stone Court Capital partner, and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Brad Howard, who is founder at Corcoran Street Group. Thank you both for being here. Brad, I would love to have you weigh in on this SALT question, because as Gregory was just telling us, this is actually something that a lot of Democrats in blue states would like to see go higher. Is this Donald Trump's way of making sure he has the requisite votes to get whatever other tax cuts he wants through?
Yeah, and I was on, my boss was a Ways and Means Committee member, and we were part of the negotiations on a lot of the, what we did in the Inflation Reduction Act. And there was a big push for SALT then, if you recall. The problem with SALT is that it's incredibly expensive once you repeal it. And I think when the Republicans did it in 2017, they thought they were doing I guess a dig at high tax states like New York and California, and trying to send them to states like Texas and Florida. So as a Florida member, we supported the reinstatement of the tax, or getting rid of the cap there, or supported that effort anyway. Like, we're not what I'm saying is that when you're from a low tax state, this doesn't really impact you, but the high tax states. So you talk about, there's Orange County Republicans that lost elections over this issue. So it's a very real thing. And you've got this interesting bedfellows of Democrats and Republicans in New Jersey and New York and California that are pushing this. And keep in mind, again, 1 to 4 seat majority that Johnson's got to do. You're not going to get a single Democratic vote on reconciliation. None, because it's a purely partisan process. So I don't know how they put this together and compromise on this and keep it within a reasonable price tag.
Rick, you know the importance of this issue as someone who spends as much time as you do in the Washington, D.C. and New York City areas. What lines, however, will the Trump team find when it comes to all of these tax proposals? We can talk about SALT all day long, but as Gregory Korte reminded us, it was no tax on tips, on overtime, on so many other issues that when it comes time to sit down and talk about extending the 2017 tax cuts, it could get to be a more complicated conversation, no?
Yeah, because then you're talking about the deficit. And the reality is that Donald Trump campaigned as much on trying to rein in government spending as he did on these tax cut giveaways. Now, maybe not. Maybe he said more about tax cut giveaways than anything else combined. But the reality is all this costs us an enormous amount, as Brad points out. This is massive budget impact. I mean, this is how he paid for a large portion of the 2017 tax cuts, was by putting a cap on SALT and reaping the benefits to the Treasury. So how you replace that, especially if you are adding additional tax cuts beyond the core 2017 tax cuts, and we've heard nothing really from the team around Trump about maybe excluding and letting fall by the wayside some of the 2017 tax cuts to try and maybe upgrade the policy to be more relevant to tax reform than just tax cuts. And so it's a real problem for them. They can't look like they've come into office and spent hundreds of billions of new dollars on defense, hundreds of billions of new dollars on the border, tax cuts everywhere, and they wound up spending more into the deficit than Joe Biden did in his 4 years. And that would be a real problem for MAGA and the Republicans.
But that's the point of the Doge, right? Rick, get Elon Musk and Vivek in there to recommend a lot of spending cuts that could help offset this.
Well,
yeah, but if you're adding hundreds of billions of dollars to the pile, it's not just cutting this, but making up for it in addition to the cuts that you're already planning on. Look, I mean, in the budget today is the expiration of the Trump tax cuts 2017 in 2025. So, it's a huge windfall right now for the federal government. If you look at how you plan for the next 10 years, the more they take out of that planning for the next 10 years, the bigger that deficit's going to get. And of course, we haven't proven yet whether or not the Doge will work, and you can actually go find trillions of dollars in cuts.
Fair enough.
Talk to us about the Doge, Brad Howard. You spent enough time in the House to see a couple of blue ribbon panels go by. What makes us think any of this will actually end up in policy?
Yeah, I think when you look at, so it's not a real department, it's called Department of Government Efficiency, but it's not. And you would have to create it by statute, of which Democrats could filibuster. So I don't see it coming to fruition as an agency. It may just stay this quasi kind of working group. There is a subcommittee under oversight that's going to come to fruition on the House side, but they don't really have much jurisdiction over able to introduce bills in this space, because it's strictly kind of an appropriations thing. So you're going to see appropriators kind of balk their heads at this effort, but you've got a pretty powerful duo in Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. And with Elon Musk threatening to fund primary challenges against Republicans now who don't fall in line, this could have some real weight. We'll see. The problem is that Democrats are very concerned that the Republicans are going to drive up deficits so high and the national debt so high that they're then going to demand or force spending cuts. And so essentially what you're doing is cutting taxes for the wealthy and multinational corporations. And you're already seeing Republicans talk about cutting Social Security benefits. They're going to cut food stamps. They're going to cut all infrastructure dollars. They're going to cut all this investment in green energy. So we really start to see massive deficits and massive cuts, and Americans are just left high and dry. And I think that's the concern when you have billionaires running the presidency.
I want to ask you both about something else. As we mentioned, the reason that Donald Trump was at the New York Stock Exchange today talking about these ideas around taxes was because he was selected as Time's Person of the Year and sat down with an interview, with Time for an interview because of that. And in part, they talked about the war in Ukraine. And Trump said, quote, "I want to reach an agreement. And the only way you're going to reach an agreement is not to abandon," when he was asked directly if he would abandon Ukraine. Rick, what does that signal to you?
Yeah, look, I mean, he's a negotiator, and he knows that Biden's in the process of chunking as much cash and weapons into Ukraine as he can get done between now and January 20th. And that's tens of billions of dollars on top of everything else we've already spent, to get the number closer to 100 billion. And Donald Trump sees that as leverage. And the point about his leverage, though, that shouldn't be mistaken, is it's only leverage if you agree to suspend those payments or those weapons shipments if there is peace, right? In other words, it's great to say, hey, I've got, $50 billion in the pipeline that I can cut off if you make peace with me. The problem with that is it's cutting off that economic aid too. And so, I think it's a positive in the sense that we've always thought that this would be the approach that Donald Trump would make, is that we've got all this work and effort and weapons and money going toward helping Ukraine beat back the invasion of Russia. And that's a great negotiating position until at which point in time you give it away. And then the question is, what guarantees did you get that Russia isn't going to play bad actor in the region again?
Brad Howard, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to set you up here. It's only a minute left. We're going to be talking later this hour with New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, who is calling for a balanced budget amendment. He says it's time to reconsider the idea. As somebody who has spent enough time on Capitol Hill to know better, does it stand a chance?
No. And here it's mainly the public opinion is there for it. My boss was introduced a balanced budget amendment when she was in Congress nearly every term and fought hard for it. The problem is a constitutional amendment requires 2/3 vote in the House and Senate, and then ratification among the states. The president actually has no role here other than to champion or oppose it. But when you look at the question is, there's several balanced budget amendments out there. The real question is, do you protect Social Security and Medicare in those amendments, or do you ban, for instance, Republican BBAs, which are balanced budget amendments? They oppose tax increases, which you're going to need to balance the budget. Democrats oppose cuts to programs like earned benefits like Social Security and Medicare. So there's never an agreement, and it's an impossible task.
No easy answer. Brad Howard and Rick Davis, great panel. Thank you for the great conversation.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, which was absolutely rocked a week ago Sunday by the news that President Biden was pardoning his son Hunter, despite, of course, insistence for an extended period of time that he would not do so. Yeah. And it opened up a question as to what more pardons could be coming from this president before he leaves the Oval Office. We've, of course, heard rumblings about the notion that he could, for example, pardon the likes of former Congresswoman Liz Cheney or former Congressman Adam Kinzinger. But those aren't the pardons we got today, though we did get a lot of them, 39 to be exact, and nearly 1,500 sentences commuted by the president, Joe.
It's a number that jumps off the page, and Donald Trump, I should say Joe Biden, pardon me, made clear that he's not done. The quote from the President of the United States, "I will take more steps in the weeks ahead," unquote. We do have questions about what this means for the rest, of course, of the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration. And Kailey and I have really been taken since that Hunter Biden pardon by the work of Kim Wehle with some of the best analysis. She literally wrote the book on this. Law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, author of Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why. Kim, it's great to see you. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know if we're done yet. It's sounding like we're not, but these 15, roughly 100 people released from prison, placed on home confinement during COVID. Was this an appropriate use of the pardon power?
It looks like this was to allow these folks to not be reverted back to prison in this moment. So the idea behind the pardon power is primarily mercy, that the president has tremendous amount of discretion to assess what the conviction was, what the sentence was, and whether in fairness it makes sense to lift some conditions of that criminal conviction. So this does not, I think fall into a troubling pardon, although it's unusual for a president to do it in these numbers. Of course, Joe Biden's done it once before with nonviolent, low-level marijuana convictions as well.
Well, so let's talk about a pardon then that many did find troubling, which was the pardon of his son Hunter, not just because of the fact that he said he wasn't going to go ahead with that, but also because of the unique nature of that pardon. He wasn't just pardoning him for the crimes he was convicted of, but essentially giving him a years-long period of time for which anything he did, he could not be prosecuted for. He was pardoned for, Kim. And I wonder what precedent has now been set as we consider whether or not Joe Biden might look to issue a similar pardon to the one he gave his son.
Well, it was actually, I think, longer. It might have been 10 years. It's not unique, however, in that there have been presidents in the past that have issued general pardons without anything specific. For example, Jimmy Carter issued pardons for people who dodged the draft. The pardon is actually quite vague. It doesn't identify any people in particular. And something more tailored to an individual would be, of course, Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon, which was not just for the crimes that were ready to go in an indictment against Nixon that wasn't actually filed against him, but it was ready to go. But any additional crimes that he could have been charged with within that particular time period around Watergate. I believe the Biden pardon, the Hunter Biden, what you're identifying as unusual, was likely in anticipation of the incoming president, Donald Trump's promise to use the Department of Justice as an arm of retribution and to go after folks that he believes just should be prosecuted for having taken action that's inconsistent with Donald Trump's interests. Now, that's not Hunter Biden, but Hunter Biden, by virtue of being Hunter Biden, has definitely been had a target on his back politically in ways that other folks that engaged in the kind of behavior that gave rise to his plea deal as well as his conviction for lying on a gun application in Delaware for about his drug addiction, and then in California some tax problems that he later paid back with interest. These are not big, high-level crimes of violence, but I think the concern across the board is what's the Justice Department going to look like under a second Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, just the idea of these preemptive pardons, if we can call them that, has been getting a lot of talk around Washington. Some folks are raising their hands. Benny Thompson was asked about it, the former chair of the January 6th committee in the House, concerned about being targeted. We've heard Liz Cheney's name bandied about, Adam Kinzinger. What would that mean for the precedent in this administration if Joe Biden went there?
So those people actually, to the extent to which they were taking actions in connection with the speech and debate clause, there's arguably some immunity they already would have. I think the bigger concern really is the lower level folks that maybe participated as witnesses. You know, these documents, some of it is probably not even public, that Donald Trump would then have access to, that kind of retribution. But absolutely, this would be a precedent-setting action, but my view is that it would be in response to a precedent-setting plan for the Department of Justice. You know, arguably under Hoover, there was J. Edgar Hoover, there was the Justice Department used to spy on political enemies, famously Martin Luther King, for example. That was, not a proud part of American history. What Donald Trump and what looks like his cabinet picks seem to promise is widespread, potentially vindictive prosecutions. And for that, this would be setting a brand new precedent with a lot of problematic implications around across the board.
Well, so as we consider what future preemptive pardons might be given to, say, members of the January 6th committee, there's also the question of pardons for people who have been convicted of crimes on January 6th. Just today, in an interview published with Time, the president-elect, who of course is Time's Person of the Year, was asked if he would pardon all January 6 defendants. He said yes. When asked, "You're going to do all of them?" He said, "I'm going to do case by case, and if they were nonviolent, I think they've been greatly punished." And the answer is, I will be doing that. I'm going to look to see if there were some that were really out of control. Keeping in mind here, Kim, that there are already hundreds of people who have been convicted or pleaded guilty to crimes related to their activities on January 6th, with the majority of those receiving some time behind bars. But given there have been different crimes and different sentences here, can he just do this in a blanket way, or will it have to be case by case, single names?
He could do it in a blanket way, or it could be case by case. The pardon power in the Constitution is extremely broad. There's very few cases that have made it to the Supreme Court to narrow it or put any limitations on it. And of course, in the Trump versus U.S. immunity case, where the court created criminal immunity for presidents, it went out of its way to get out a black Sharpie and underscore that the pardon power is extremely broad as far as the president's authority. To answer your question on January 6th, that would be about lawyers crafting the language of a more generic pardon to be sure that it captures the folks that Donald Trump would want to be included in that. I think there are over 1,800 prosecutions at this point. If he's talking about violent offenses, that kind of language, sort of accepting maybe people from the pardon if they engaged in violence, maybe that would be in there. Or he could give a list. I think it's on the Justice Department's website, fairly straightforward and easy. But that kind of pardon, I think, is of a concern in a way that, say, the Hunter Biden pardon was not, because of the nature of January 6th and the violence that was part of that. We have to ask ourselves with pardons, going back to George Washington, is a pardon being issued going to make the country less safe, either because that person will go on to commit crimes, or because the pardon is being done in a self-interested way, in a corrupt way, in a way to allow the president to commit crimes? Those are different categories, I think, of pardons than pardons under the traditional way for mercy that go back before the King of England, back to the Bible. Jesus Christ was denied a pardon, and that gave birth to the Christian religion. The whole idea is the criminal justice system, people fall through the cracks, and there needs to be a fix. A survey done this summer, both Republicans and Democrats, a majority of both did not want to see pardons for the January 6th people that participated in that, because of the concern of violence around elections and an emboldening of the energy around what happened on that day.
Kim, you're writing in an op-ed in The Hill today, "Say goodbye to federal protections and hello to Trump's advancing loyalist army." You're writing about Schedule F, which we've heard a lot about, and of course, some of the names that could be coming into government here and the many that could be leaving as Donald Trump promises to drain the swamp. What would it mean for the Justice Department?
For the Schedule F for the Justice Department, that's a great question. There are scheduled officials within the Justice Department. And when I say that and I explain in the op-ed, what does that mean? Basically, there was what was known as the spoils system that kind of took hold of the federal government early in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, where presidents just put their cronies and loyalists in across the board, populating the American federal government. And Congress responded to that and said, no, we don't want that. That doesn't create an effective workforce. There's a lot of incompetence, and loyalists don't breed a democratic spirit. So they passed a law and said, we want competent, neutral civil servants. And that's pretty much been the standard since then. But there's exceptions. Those are called schedules. That's Schedule A through E. And then F is what Donald Trump promises to add, which would be converting some of these folks into basically people that aren't protected by the other protections for the civil service workers and could be fired at will. But you raise a great question, which is, how will the Justice Department operate under Donald Trump #2? Will they be loyalists or will they uphold the rule of law?
I guess we all have to wait to find out. Kim, thank you so much for joining. Kim Wehle is author of Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why, also law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law here on Balance of Power. Some quick breaking news to mention. Emmanuel Macron's office says a new French premier will be announced Friday morning, so we'll learn the replacement of Michel Barnier. We'll have more here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
One of the best pieces of news I heard today was that Jessica Roth was coming on. And I'm pretty sure I could talk to Jessica Roth about anything, but she's not here to talk salt. We have another big story when it comes to the pardons and commutations here out of the White House with, my gosh, these numbers. It jumps off the page. When you start reading into the names, though, and the justification, it might not be quite as fun as it seems. The president, though, is commuting the sentences of some 1,500 people released from prison and placed on home confinement during COVID. He's also pardoning 39 Americans convicted of nonviolent crimes, and he says, well, he's not done yet. Co-director, the Jacob Burns Center for Ethics and the Practice of Law at Cardozo Law, former federal prosecutor, SDNY, Jessica Roth. It's great to see you, Jessica. Thank you so much for coming in. This got your attention, surely. Were these justified?
Well, it appears that they were, and were consistent with the way in which the extraordinary power entrusted to the president by the Constitution to grant pardons and clemency has been exercised. Obviously, I haven't gone through and looked at the details about every individual, but in terms of the reasons that the president gave for granting his power as he did for these groups of individuals, these are traditional reasons to exercise these extraordinary powers. Some of these people were sent home from prison during the COVID pandemic and conducted themselves in an exemplary manner, suggesting that they did not require being returned to prison. Other people were convicted of crimes that might have been prosecuted differently today under current rules or laws or norms about prosecution with respect to drug offenses. So these are the kinds of considerations that have typically been taken into account by the presidency and also those working with the president to help the president exercise this power. There is a whole apparatus within the White House and the Department of Justice for reviewing petitions for pardons and clemency to really look at the individual records and the circumstances, and also some of these issues about whether laws and norms have changed. So these seem to be consistent with that tradition.
As Josh Wingrove just said, these aren't 1,500 hunters, although the president says he will take more steps in the weeks ahead. And I want to ask you about this idea of preemptive pardons in a minute. But the previous record, I didn't know this, was Barack Obama, 330 in one day before he left office in 2017. But this is a COVID phenomenon, right? I guess these are extreme times that call for an extreme number, Professor?
Yes, my understanding is that the vast majority of those pardons and clemencies that were announced today, the clemencies, were for people who were sent home to home confinement during COVID. And so obviously that is an extraordinary set of circumstances.
What do you think about what we're about to hear? Benny Thompson, who chaired the January 6th committee, Democrat in the House, says he's open to a pardon. I believe the quote was, it's his prerogative. If he offers it to me, I would accept it, but it's his choice. Liz Cheney has been on the list, along with a few others. What do you think of the concept of a preemptive pardon? Doing this for somebody who's technically not in any trouble.
Yeah, I'm troubled by the concept of the preemptive pardon. I was troubled by it, frankly, when the president did it for Hunter Biden, although I understood in that circumstance why he would do it, given what some of the statements by President-elect Trump and by his prospective nominees, for example, to run the FBI, about intending to go after Hunter Biden and some of these individuals on the so-called enemies list. So I understand the rationale for doing it. That said, that is not the norm for how the pardon power has been exercised. The 1,500 people we were just talking about, that is the norm and how the pardon power has been exercised, not to do it preemptively in language that essentially gives people immunity for everything they might have done, every crime they could have possibly committed during a period of time. I'm troubled by that becoming normalized. It also, frankly, wouldn't insulate people from all harassment. So, for example, a congressional committee could still investigate individuals who had been granted a pardon, subjecting them to sort of the difficulties of responding to subpoenas and having to testify before Congress, having to retain lawyers to represent them in that regard. Other agencies, government agencies, could investigate them, like the IRS. So it's not like a pardon accomplishes everything that people might think that it would. It does preempt a criminal prosecution of the individuals who are named, but it doesn't accomplish everything. And so because of sort of the practical considerations of just how effective is it at its intended aims, and normalizing this idea of a preemptive pardon, and also suggesting that the people involved did anything wrong, for all of those reasons, I am terribly concerned by it, even though I do understand the rationale for doing it, given these extraordinary times we find ourselves in, where people are literally on an announced enemies list.
You know, even Bill Clinton doesn't think it's a good idea. He was asked about this on ABC TV. He was on The View, as a matter of fact. He said, I think it's a very personal thing. But then he stopped himself and he said, I hope he won't do that. This idea of preemptive pardons. And I wonder if it has to do with precedent, Professor. I know we're not in Bill Clinton's head here, but if Joe Biden goes there, what does that mean for Donald Trump in his next term?
Yeah, so when I said a moment ago, I'm troubled by the idea of normalizing this. I mean, that's really what I'm talking about, is sort of setting a norm, a new norm about the use of the pardons in this preemptive broad way, setting the precedent that other presidents then would cite as essentially making it normal and something that is not extraordinary if they were to do so. I don't know in the case of former president and President-elect Trump, to what extent the precedent set by Joe Biden would actually affect what Trump would do himself in terms of granting preemptive pardons. But in terms of how the public receives it, the media receives it, how people in our country think about it, I think it does matter whether Joe Biden does it first, and whether it becomes essentially an accepted part of political and legal actions that we just grow accustomed to. I hope it won't.
As we spend some time with Jessica Roth here on Bloomberg, I have to ask you about Donald Trump's legal situation, his personal legal situation, because, Professor, we spent so many months talking about the four federal cases, or two federal cases against him. We had Georgia, we had New York. And it's interesting to see what's going on here. Jack Smith may be out of business for now, but Alvin Bragg says he's not, opposing Trump's motion to have his hush money case dismissed. Is this going to follow him into his presidency, or his next term, I should say, or be waiting for him when he's done?
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, we're waiting to hear the ruling from the trial court on these very issues. And then whatever the trial court decides would be subject to appellate review at the intermediate court in New York, and then the New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York, and then in theory before the United States Supreme Court. So we don't know yet what's going to happen. Certainly, it appears from the filings by the district attorney's office that they are not intent on going ahead full steam. They are open to the idea of holding the whole case in abeyance while Trump serves out his 4-year term. They're also open to the sentencing going forward and whatever sentence is imposed, having that held in abeyance for the 4 years. They're also open to having the sentencing proceed. And then there would only be essentially appeals and the service of the sentence, although, again, the district attorney's office is open to a variety of ways in which that sentence could be fashioned, including no prison sentence, a fine instead, perhaps, or just essentially unconditional discharge, which would be no further action at all. And so the district attorney's office is laying out a whole host of options for the trial court in terms of how to proceed if the court is inclined to proceed currently, or how to essentially hold the case in abeyance for 4 years. And so we just need to see what the trial court's going to do. And then if there are appeals that ensue before even the next step at the trial court level, and I suspect that's going to happen, what's going to happen. I don't expect the trial court is going to dismiss the case outright, which is what Trump's lawyers are asking for. And so if that's the case, then I expect we're going to see immediate appeals before any sentence.
Fascinating. I want to take one of your classes someday. You think I could pass her class, James? I'm thinking I'd get confused really quickly, but I know I'd learn a lot. It's like going to school whenever we talk to Professor Jessica Roth. I only have a minute left, Professor. Let's come full circle back to where we started. Would it not behoove Joe Biden to pardon Donald Trump on his way out?
Well, that's interesting. Obviously, he doesn't have the authority to do that for the state prosecutions. He would only have authority to pardon him for the federal cases.
Right.
And
no one would be talking about Hunter anymore.
It's true. I think people are going to be talking less about Hunter now that the president has exercised his authority to pardon many other individuals who are not related to him. The cases against Trump, the federal cases, have already been dismissed without prejudice. I think there's very little likelihood that they would actually be resurrected after the 4-year term. So I just don't see that happening.
Had to ask. It's great to see you, as always, Jessica Roth, co-director, Jacob Burns Center for Ethics and the Practice of Law at Cardozo Law. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.